The time has come for the Cobra to rise up and reveal himself.
Welcome back, my quiver of capitalists, to AP Economics, presented by Cobranomics, your all-American history teacher, gold standard of economics, le champion of classical liberalism, and sensei of supply side, Professor G here, and today we are going to take a look at the graphs of the banking system, and there are three graphs. We're going to break them up into three different parts, and then we are going to see how actions by the Federal Reserve start in the money market graph, go through the banking system, and affect the full employment graph. But first, we're just going to introduce all of them, and then we'll put them together. First, the most important graph of the banking system is the money market graph. The money market graph represents what we've been talking about, how the Federal Reserve is the banker's bank, and how the Federal Reserve oversees the money supply. And so let's take a look at it. First, let's start with our parameters of the graph. Remember, all graphs are visualizations. So our first graph, the money market graph, is just a visualization of all the concepts we were talking about, and how the Federal Reserve is the banker's bank, and how the Federal Reserve is in charge of the money supply. So first, we have our nominal interest rate. This is the general interest rate that the Federal Reserve targets. And we have our quantity of money, the amount of M1 and M2 in the banking system. And we have, so those are our parameters. And our parameters cover the goals of the Federal Reserve to affect the nominal interest rate. Remember, the Federal Reserve doesn't directly change the nominal interest rate. It has to use one of its three tools, which will change the money supply, which will then change the nominal interest rate. And as the Federal Reserve changes the money supply, it will also change the quantity of money in the banking system. So let's take a look at our two curves. First, we're going to start with money demanded. This is actually the most complicated of the curves, because this is the one that is based on human nature. And money demanded represents our households' ability and willingness, A and W, ability and willingness to hold cash, to hold money as M1 cash versus the interest rate. So the nominal interest rate represents our opportunity cost of holding money as cash. The higher the interest rate, the higher the opportunity cost. So we see the higher the interest rates, the less we hold money as cash. Because the higher the interest rate, our money should be in M2 and not M1. The lower the interest rate, the lower the opportunity cost to hold money as cash, because you're not earning that much of an interest rate. So we see with the interest rate, the lower it is, the more we demand money as, the more we're more able and more willing to hold money as cash, versus higher the interest rate, the less willing and less able we are to hold money as cash. Really, the less willing we are, because we realize that if the higher the interest rate, that money should be in a savings account, which is to earn money, so that money is compounding and growing on itself, than holding money as cash in our wallet. The money supply, so where money demanded and money supply meet, is equilibrium in the banking system. That at this interest rate, this is where we are holding cash, but also where M1 and M2 are. The money supply does not change. The money supply is vertical. Now, money demanded is the trickier of the two, because money demanded shifts for the behavioral science aspect of economics. And there's three basic reasons, and sometimes the test will give you subcategories of these reasons. Like, the test won't actually say these reasons, but you have to figure out, okay, well, when you're reading a question, will people require more cash on hand, or less cash on hand? Do people seem more willing to hold cash or less willing to hold cash? So, and it depends, and there's no great rule of thumb, but the best thing you can do when confronted with a money demanded question is remember, it is about ability and willingness to hold money as cash on hand. Why do we hold money as cash or choose not to hold money as cash? For three general categories. One, transaction demand. We want to have money as cash for transactions. So, basic things like income increases. This would make us more willing and more able to hold cash on hand because we have more income, we're willing to spend more. If we're willing to spend more, we could assume we are using more cash, therefore our willingness will increase. So this would increase money demanded. Or less income. Sometimes they might ask a technology question revolved around transaction, such as the use of credit cards. This would decrease our need for cash on hand because we're using credit cards instead of cash. So it's tricky. You have to think about the behavioral science aspect. Are people more willing or able to use cash based on the scenario? So that's transaction demand, using cash as a basic transaction, as a basic medium of exchange. Speculation demand involves more, do we want to hold cash? Do we want to hold cash because we want to have it as a store of value? Or do we want to put our cash in something else like bonds and stocks? So if we want to put our money in bonds and stocks, we are holding less cash. If we're more reticent to buy bonds and stocks, then we will hold more cash. So the other type of demand is speculation demand. Do we want to hold cash on hand as a store of value? We feel safer with our money as cash. Or are we willing to not hold our money as cash, but put money instead into stocks and bonds and other financial assets? And last is precautionary. What do we feel about inflation? Inflation increases the need for cash because it makes us have to spend more money. Our purchasing power is decreasing. So the two are related. So again, just think when you come across these questions, rather than me giving you a whole bunch of general rules of this happens, of breaking out each of these categories, know that these are the three general categories. Medium of exchange, do we want to hold money as a store of value or put that in stocks and bonds? And what are our concerns about the future or inflation? And then ask yourself, well, how will this increase our ability or willingness to hold cash on? Do we want more? How will this increase our ability or willingness to hold money as cash? And as this changes, then we'll get to our shifts of both of these in a second or later on. And first, let's take a look at our other curve, which is money supply. And money supply is much more straightforward. So money supply is the more simpler of the curves because it is only controlled by the Federal Reserve, which is why it is vertical, because no matter the interest rate, money supply will not change. There is only one thing that can change the amount of M1 and M2 in the banking system, in circulation, and that is the Federal Reserve. So the money supply will always be vertical. Quantity does not change because the only thing that can change money supply, Federal Reserve doing either an expansionary or a contractionary monetary policy by either increasing or decreasing the required reserve rate, increasing or decreasing the discount rate, or increasing or decreasing the open market operations, which is the most common one. That's the only way money supply can either increase, shift to the right, or decrease, shift to the left. So let's just take a look quickly at the changes and how they affect equilibrium, the interest rate at which money supply and money demand intersect. Let's start with money demanded. So let's say we have an increase in income. So this would shift this would shift the money demand curve to the right, because with an increase in income, we could assume that we are going to incorporate that income into our monthly budget, and therefore, if we're more willing and able to spend more, we could also assume we are more willing and able to use cash to spend more. So money demand would increase. Shift to the right, notice money supply remains. So if the scenario said income increases, illustrate the results to nominal interest rate on the money market graph, it's not telling you necessarily is it money supply or money demanded. That's for you to figure out. But you know the Federal Reserve didn't do anything, so money supply remains the same. Now, what happens to money demanded? If there's an increase in income, we are more willing and able to spend, so therefore we could assume we're more willing and able to need some money as cash. So money demanded would shift to the right. Money supply remains the same, but let's take a look at what happens graphically. So we see as money demanded increases, the interest rate, and we move up, our equilibrium moves up, and our nominal interest rate increases. Well, why? Because if we are using money as cash, even though this is the amount of money supply in circulation did not change, the amount of money in the bank changed. We're taking our money out of M2, putting it in M1, so now within the banking system, banks have less money as we are demanding money as cash and not holding it as M2, so therefore, banks are now going to have to raise their interest rates to send a signal that they do not have as much money to loan and are going to have to make more with less. So our actions affect the amount of money that is in the banking system as we take our money from M2 and put it in M1 and use it as cash to spend. So money supply remained the same, the amount of money in circulation changed, but the amount of money in the banking system decreased as we put our money into M1. Let's say inversely, let's say there's an increase in credit card usage. Well, that means we need less cash on hand, and the money demanded, so therefore we could leave our money in the bank. We don't need money as cash. Money demand will shift to the left, showing that we do not need to have money as cash. And now let's take a look what happens. Here we have a new equilibrium, E1. Move that down here. And we see that the nominal interest rate decreased. Why? Because now banks' excess reserves have increased. The amount of money we have in the banks has increased. Since we don't need to take out that cash, we can leave that cash in the banks. And so now banks have more money, which they could loan out. And how do banks send a signal they have more money? By lowering the nominal interest rates. Again, this whole time, the amount of money in circulation has not changed. But our individual actions as consumers, in this case using the transaction demand, has changed, and that has affected, and as we change our need for cash, that affects the bank's excess reserves, which will then affect their ability to offer a higher or lower nominal interest rate. But all through this, money supply remained the same. Now let's take a look briefly at how money supply shifting affects this graph. Now, let's take a look at what happens when the Federal Reserve does monetary policy, which will either increase or decrease the money supply. So, let's say the Federal Reserve does a contractionary monetary policy, which is either increasing the required reserve rate, increasing the discount rate, or selling bonds. This will decrease the amount of money in circulation and in the banking system, and would shift money supply to the left. And remember, left and right is always decrease and increase. So money supply shifts to the left, and let's take a look at what happens. As the banks have less money, the banks will raise their nominal interest rate, and we see here equilibrium moves from E to E1, quantity of money goes from Q to Q1, and the nominal interest rate goes from I to I1. And as the nominal interest rate increases, this decreases our demand for cash, as now the opportunity cost for holding cash increases, so we're more likely to put our money from M1 from M1 cash into M2 savings or certificates of deposits. But the main thing about this graph is the money supply. We can illustrate what happens to the money supply. It shifts to the left, and that it increases the nominal interest rate, the main effect of monetary policy. The reverse, if the Federal Reserve were to increase the money supply by either decreasing the reserve requirement ratio, decreasing the discount rate, or buying bonds, this would be an expansionary policy and would shift money supply to the right. And again, remember, this is all about visualization. So what are we visualizing? We are visualizing what the Federal Reserve does. It is expanding the money supply through one of those three mechanisms, and money supply shifts to the right. What does this do? This increases, literally shows, we see literally on the x-axis, it increases the quantity of money in circulation. And as banks have more money, they are able to lower the interest rate. Because remember, the nominal interest rate is also a signal from the banks to people who want to take out a loan. Hey, we have more money, come take out a loan. How do you know we have more money? Here's lower nominal interest rates. Nominal interest rate decreases, and as the nominal interest rate decreases, this also increases the quantity of money demanded as M1, because now we have a lower opportunity cost to hold money as cash instead of savings, which now has a lower nominal interest rate. So most importantly about this graph, while the money demanded is interesting about showing that human behavior aspect of economics, the most important thing about this graph, which will then set up the future graphs of the banking system and going back to the full employment graph, is money supply. How when the Federal Reserve does something, this either decreases or increases the money supply, and thus the quantity of money in circulation, and also increases or decreases the nominal interest rate. In our next graph, we're going to take a look at how this change to money supply affects the inner workings of banks in our market for loanable fund graph. But for right now, this was our money market graph, the main graph of the banking system. We'll see you for graph number 2.